Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, June 27th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Wisconsin. On the day of the debate, I wanted to talk about a battleground state and a poll before we get into some more important news, probably tomorrow and the day after, likely around Trump's VP, around the debate aftermath. And so I wanted to talk to you about a brand new poll from Marquette University. Marquette Law School has released a brand new Wisconsin poll showing Joe Biden with an advantage 51-49 amongst likely voters and tied amongst registered voters. President Biden's best performing poll in months in this battleground state. Now, it comes at a time in the direct aftermath of Donald Trump's New York hush money trial, where he was found guilty of 34 counts of felonies. Donald Trump now being a convicted felon, now 55% of voters in Wisconsin believe that Donald Trump was in fact guilty, while 36% say that he was not, and 9% say they simply don't know. Now, this Wisconsin poll comes also to around the same time that the national average has shifted back and forth between Trump and Biden being in the lead, and that matters for the incumbent president. Because for the entire time that 538 has been tracking the national numbers, Donald Trump has maintained a lead. And on Real Clear Politics, Donald Trump has maintained a lead for months on end. And so Wisconsin also has been one of the closer states on the presidential level. Wisconsin is a state where polling here has been quite sporadic. In 2020 was far off, overestimated Biden quite, by a large amount. And then in 2022, overestimated Republicans by around half that, overestimated Republicans from anywhere from 4 to 5 points when they ended up losing across the governor's race in the state despite having the Republican ahead. And so it really just depends on the accuracy of the poll. Marquette University also said Biden would win by more in 2020 than he actually did, and then in 2022 said Republicans would win the governor's race. And so while it isn't the perfect poll, and I don't want to treat this as if it is something that is, the end-all be-all of Wisconsin data or national data, but it certainly comes as one of the better-rated pollsters. In fact, 538 ranks it as the third best poll that they use in compiling averages here, which arguably is quite strong. Now, Marquette University Law School is Wisconsin-based. They focus primarily on this state and just really look at some individual, really important data out of the state. They're looking at crosstabs. They're looking at likely voters. They're looking at regular voters. They are registered voters. They have so much to unpack in their poll here, and it is quite interesting. They also decided to poll the 2024 Senate race here. Eric Hovde, the Republican nominee for Senate here, against Tammy Baldwin, the Democratic nominee, the incumbent Democratic senator who has been serving in this state for over a decade here. She's up for re-election, and they find that in registered voters, Tammy Baldwin wins by 5. Amongst likely voters, she wins by 7. And so these new numbers we can see tracked over months now. Registered voters, the numbers back in April had Trump up by 2. Back in January, there was a tie, so it looks like we're right about there. And back in October and November, there was a 2-point advantage for the incumbent president. And so at that time, there were more undecideds. In January, there were also more undecideds. And now they've pushed the leaners and said, make a decision. They're tied amongst registered voters, which is roughly a 2-point swing from the April numbers. The likely voter numbers look a bit better. Again, back in October and November, Biden was up by 2, but then by January, Trump was up by 1. And then in April, Trump was up by 2 amongst likely voters, a bit of a reversion from what we saw amongst registered voters. And then in likely voters, now Biden is up by 2. So that's a 4-point swing on the likely voter screen. And so as a pollster that is ranked quite high, I won't say that this is the gold standard, but it gets close to being so. And showing Biden ahead by 2 points on the likely voter screen by, tied on that end really goes to show that it is largely in line with what we've known about Wisconsin for quite some time. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are probably going to see Wisconsin as one of the closest states of this election cycle. Regardless of who wins the election, it's going to be one of the closest. The average here has now Donald Trump and Joe Biden tied 47.3 to 47.3 according to Real Clear Polling. 538 has it a bit different. Point being, though, it is exceptionally competitive. But it's good news overall for President Biden. For a while here, Trump was leading on average. From February, Trump had an advantage point over Biden for months on end. We saw it last through February and March and April and May, and now that we're getting to June, Trump had that advantage up until recently. This Marquette University poll has changed everything for national Democrats in Wisconsin. And while it may not be quite tremendous, that 55% that finds him guilty, there must be some independents who back in April didn't have this as a considerating factor when they were looking at how they were going to vote, or were not considering it rather as a factor in deciding how they would vote this election, that now they're deciding that it matters. We saw this with the Fox News poll. We saw this with a lot of national headlines that showed that independents, after Trump's guilty verdict, some of them shifted away from voting for him. And while that may not be more than even 2-3% of the electorate, it can make all the difference in elections as close as this one. Now, speaking of close races, let's take a look at where Wisconsin was back in 2020 to put things into perspective. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in Wisconsin by 0.6%. It was a very, very narrow advantage for the incumbent president, now Joe Biden. That was the incumbent president. I guess that gets confusing. Let's go ahead and talk about it in the actual terms and who they are as people. But Joe Biden ended up winning by a very narrow amount. I mean, this was the closest Rust Belt state. Pennsylvania was over a point. Michigan was nearly 3 points. And so Wisconsin being here as one that Biden won by 0.6, it was just exceptionally close. And Democrats knew that in any future election, they would have to invest heavy. Millions upon millions, tens upon tens of millions, hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars invested in the state. And now Republicans are looking at this, surprisingly enough, as a state that they are hoping to win with their Republican convention. They're spending a lot of their time in this state. They're spending a lot of money in this state. They're holding rallies in the state because Wisconsin is a key component of Donald Trump's pathway to 270. This is our presidential election map. Right now, Joe Biden, in my prediction, I have winning 271 to 267. But you notice what might be red? The state of Wisconsin. And that's because at that time, the numbers had suggested that Trump was in a better position, and arguably, out of the 3 battleground states, it seems to be the least likely to vote for President Biden. But this new poll might suggest otherwise. And again, I want to shy away from saying that this is the only reason I'm changing my consideration on this, because I do think Wisconsin deserves another look. I think there's a combination of factors. I think Wisconsin also is going to be quite heavily targeted by national Democrats. I also think, too, Michigan and Pennsylvania will have more competitive Senate elections than Wisconsin. If Tammy Baldwin is to win by 10 points, she more than likely is going to carry Joe Biden over the finish line. That is just how this works. And so Wisconsin comes in at a time where you find the polls in the head-to-head Senate race, Tammy Baldwin's up by 7 amongst registered voters. You find here that amongst registered voters there's a tie. And so there's 7-point swings in favor of the Democratic nominee for Senate here, which means that there could be some begrudging voters who are out there that would be more likely to vote for Biden, or maybe more inspired to vote in down-ballot Senate races that would begrudgingly check him at the ballot box that could push him over the top in Wisconsin. And this poll suggests that he's right at the cusp. He is right at a point where amongst likely voters, he's winning that majority. Amongst registered voters, he is tied with the former president, and that matters. Because then it comes down to a point of who wins the ground game. Who gets a begrudging amount of voters to move over to the Biden column, to vote Democrat down ballot rather than just, ignoring the top of the ticket. That's what Democrats are relying on here. And the closer they get to that, the direct contrast with the poll from Hill and Emerson College that shows Trump up by 3, or the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll that shows Trump up by 1. These polls here are getting narrower, but they are combating the narrative that Donald Trump is dominating in these battleground states. Because if there is one state, just one, where Trump has had the narrowest advantage in, it has been Wisconsin. And Democrats have been trying to claw their way back up. And it seems that Marquette University is the first to really jump on this post-verdict polling group and actually come out with a result that shows something in line with what we've been seeing on the national level. Now, the polls still don't look great for President Biden. There's no denying that. The map here looks far less impressive than what it was back in 2020. A 306 to 232 advantage, winning Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. And in this election, you saw the energy and enthusiasm on both sides. It was palpable. This was one of the most highest turnout elections we have seen, the highest turnout we have seen since the year 1900. I keep using this as an example. The last time we saw voter turnout this high was before the Titanic was built and then consequently sank. This is an election like no other, which is why 2024 isn't directly comparable despite having the candidates back up here. This race is far more competitive. As much as we might think that that's impossible, given that Biden won by 44,000 votes across Wisconsin, across Georgia, across Arizona, it certainly is more competitive. And it's more competitive even down to the presidential popular vote, where there is some circumstance and where Joe Biden wins a map like this one, but loses the national popular vote, which may be shocking, may be so out of left field, what we've known from Hillary Clinton in 2016, what we've known from Al Gore in 2000, what we've known about national politics since the beginning of the 21st century, that voters out there in these battleground states often do reflect what the popular vote says. But in some instances, they far move away from what the national popular vote says, and often to the Democratic Party's detriment. There has never been, in modern history, a Republican who has won the Electoral College, lost the Electoral College, but won the popular vote. That just simply hasn't happened. And so for this election, modern political history, we can go back to the Civil War and talk about Reconstruction era, but I'd rather not. I'd rather focus on our current state of being. The 2024 cycle, that could happen. And that would probably be one of the, honestly, the craziest things to happen in American politics. I think it would be such an interesting end to a 3-time presidential candidate, Donald Trump, to a, multi-time, I don't know what number this would be for President Biden, but, 2 candidates who have been in the running for a very, very long period of time and just have been in politics in general. I think this would be such a weird ending, something that's so out of left field, so unordinary, but honestly quite fitting and quite perfect. Regardless, though, what I'm looking at here in this, head-to-head matchup, and I'm looking at a state like Wisconsin, I think I really take away that likely voters are probably going to be the ones who drive the overall electoral margin. And that's where Democrats have really started to do better. Low propensity voters typically used to be where Democrats did really strong, and in a way they do. You are talking minority voters, urban voters, you are talking about people in different regions of the country that are less likely to vote than others, and that's because historically, it has been whiter voters that have been the most likely to vote, wealthier voters that have been the most likely to vote. The voter turnout amongst the top 1% is 98%. You take a look at, economic indicator, age. Older voters are the most likely to vote. So you have white voters are the most likely to vote, older voters are the most likely to vote, wealthier voters are the most likely to vote, and the problem here, and also suburban voters are the most likely to vote out of urban, rural, and suburban. Those 4 factors there have almost always historically been very strong for Republicans. We've seen it in the 2014 midterms, where turnout was at the lowest of any midterm we have seen in this entire century. 40% across the country, very, very low. Republicans trounced. Why? Because those voters, high propensity voters, people who vote often, tended to lean conservative. But in the era of Donald Trump, especially after his presidency, especially after Dobbs, those suburban voters, women, white voters, older voters have started to take a turn. And that's where Biden is finding his home ground. It isn't to say that he's winning without his base. His base is very much heavily minority voters, urban voters, younger voters. Those are the people that form the foundation to allow these swing voters to have a victory alongside with them. However, those swing voters at different periods of time were the most likely to turn out to vote but for the Republicans. And now we're starting to see a reversion of that, which is why you are seeing things in direct contrast with if this was the election of 2012 or even 2016, it would be such a different story, where registered voters would often be the most beneficial for Democrats. And it's about turning out that base and getting them out to vote in elections that they typically don't turn out to, versus likely voters lean conservative, lean towards Trump, lean towards Republicans, whatever it might be. That is no longer the case. And so what Marquette University has shown us is the same thing we started to see as a general trend across the country. Likely voters might be the reason Biden wins the election. Likely voters could very well be a major piece of the puzzle to a pathway to 270 for the president, a pathway to 50 for Democrats in the Senate. There is so much to unpack when we look at numbers like these that stand, again, in direct contrast with this mainstream media narrative that Trump is trouncing. And even one that I did believe in Wisconsin that Trump would be the favorite. I don't know if he would be the favorite today. I still think, though, at baseline, this election is going to be close. This election is going to be amongst the closest we have seen in a very long time. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see that, what we find between now and November is going to shake up this race quite tremendously. The debate, the state of the race when it comes down to polling, the fundraising numbers, the rallies, so much is going to change between now and November 5th. And all of it will have a direct impact on the election. And everyone can point to so many different parts of this very interesting moving election cycle. This was the reason Trump lost. This was the reason Biden lost. But it's all this culminating effect. Obviously, some things had more impacts than others. And we've seen a huge impact so far from the verdict, and we've seen a huge impact from the Dobbs decision, and generally speaking, so many other factors that have made this race as close as it is. But Wisconsin reassures us that this race is just as close as we genuinely thought it would be, which means Biden and Trump are in for the long run. This is going to matter Every last second, every last dollar, every last volunteer, everyone and everything is going to matter in this election. And this Marquette University Law poll shows that while Biden is making improvements, certainly making improvements, it still is something that shows that there's a lot of work to be done. It's never secure, and it's going to be a very long and grueling campaign season. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist of my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Rather, tomorrow.